figured if I'm gonna do a wrap up, it may as well be April, because that is my monkey brain month post Restore Me. I haven't really done sit down videos since I started becoming a Restore Me stan channel and doing reading vlogs, so even though I'm not huge into wrap ups, I just wanted to be able to sit down and talk about books in a candid way like I used to. And I read a handful of books in April I would like to talk about in just a sit down formal video while I have makeup on today, which is a very rare occurrence. If you don't watch my vlogs, you won't know that after Restore Me, it's been a hot struggle picking up books. I keep having to turn to easy to consume stuff that just goes by quickly, otherwise my brain checks out. If I included in this video the books I tried to read, it would be twice as long. But after Restore Me, the first book I decided to pick up is a book called Rhapsodic by Laura Thalassa. This is a trilogy that currently has 2 books out. It's either indie published or self-published. It follows a girl named Callie who is a siren. This book takes place in the current time following her, as well as flashback scenes of this time when she was young. I don't know if I can spoil the event, but she gets in a pickle at the beginning of the book and has to call upon this mythical being to help her out, and it's this man called the Bargainer, and his whole deal is he'll do something for you as long as you give him a deed that you will owe him. So it's like an eye for an eye. He helps her get out of that situation, but then she ends up owing him a deed. But after that day, she's young and she forms an attraction to him, so she keeps calling upon him to just hang out with her and be her friend. I'm about to roast this book, but that's so relatable. Long story short, over the course of a year or so, she ends up accruing like 300 deeds she owes this guy, and then he disappears from her life for years, still having 300 deeds that she owes him. So the current timeline takes place where the Bargainer now is coming back saying, I need your help. It's time for you to come with me and repay all these. It takes place in dual narrative between them two, and you see their relationship unfold. That's not a spoiler. We all know it's a new adult book. It's like the Walmart brand of Akamath, and it's so frustrating to talk about because on one hand, I want to love it so much and I want it to be the Fae story we all love. The idea for this is so solid, but it's so weakly written. You can very much tell that it needs a lot of editing. So although the romance is very appropriate and non-harmful, that's the bar that we have in new adult. The writing style was just so clunky and so irritating. For a fantasy book, I would have preferred it to be a lot more mature, but it still had that tone of new adult books where it's like, oh my lord, his abs were glistening. I'm just like, and we just needed so much more explanation and world building and getting to know the characters. These characters were interesting, but they were not fleshed out whatsoever. It just needs editing, and it would have been so good. Regardless, I read the sequel as well, which is called A Strange Hymn. The first half of it, I loved it even more because we've developed a little more. There's new stuff that has occurred that I can't say because of spoilers. In the first half of the book, you really get to know those 2 characters so much more, and it was getting more interesting. But the last half of the book deals with drama within other courts and between court members, and none of that was fleshed out as well. So we're just getting to know these characters, and I'm like, oh good, now we can actually have a good book. And then it brings in more characters that are then underdeveloped and we don't care about their story, or at least I didn't. Whereas I gave the first book 3 stars, I gave the sequel 2 stars. Once again, it just needs so much more editing, so much more fleshed out. I was ending up skim reading the second book toward the end just because I really didn't care about the action. I wanted it to return to the characters we love so much. Additionally, in this book, there's a black side character who I love, but the way she's written is just every other word out of her mouth is either a cuss word or being like, girl. Just such stereotypical loud black girl trope whenever she's speaking. I don't know if any black reviewers have talked about that at all. I couldn't find anything, but it was throughout both books, but in this one it was so noticeable, and I think it just needs editing once again. I like the series because it talks about the main character being a survivor of sexual assault, but there's a couple of lines that conflict with the fact that the author's trying to make this moral about sexual assault being bad. The narrative of him saying you owe me can sometimes be problematic in the story, so anytime that they're joking about like, oh, I'm gonna do this to you, she's like, haha, you wouldn't, and he's just like, that's what you think. It's like, it's creepy. I'm not saying don't read them because they certainly are really cute, fun romances, but I wish this could get picked up by a publisher and she just revamp the whole thing and it would be so good. I believe the last one comes out either in October or December. I do plan on reading it. I don't plan on giving it 5 stars, but I'm in it for the romance and the characters. And then I read another new adult series because I just needed some light and happy smut. I had the last 2 books in a series. The first one I read a couple of years ago. It was called something, I'll put it there. It's the Off the Map series by Leah Riley. The second book was called Sideswiped and the third book was called Inside Out. I gave both of them 4 stars, but Inside Out is more of a 4.5 star. I enjoyed it. That's my favorite in the series. The story follows Talia, who is a girl from LA studying abroad in Australia. The first book follows her adventures there, meeting people and, you know, boys. This is an own voices novel about OCD. It's not super present in the first and second book, but in the third book it focuses a lot on it, and that's one of the reasons I love the third book. I'll talk about that in a second. I just really like this series because it's one of the only healthy romances I've ever come across. I think it talks about really important topics that typically aren't mentioned in new adult, like masturbation and sex toys and waxing, all that fun stuff that comes with being a young adult but people gloss over because it's not romantic. This series does a great job at tackling that and just being very candid. Like I said previously, I love the third book because it specifically focuses on how to be in a relationship with someone who has a mental illness and the different ways you have to be there for your partner versus a neurotypical person or someone who doesn't have anxiety. The only thing that I find so frustrating about these books is that the writing style is dumb. The characters in dialogue are constantly trying to make a joke and one-up each other and be sarcastic. I love that. I love characters that can joke around it. I think it's really realistic and cute. Even when they're dying of malaria, they're still making jokes to each other. There were certain points where I was just reading it out loud to my friends as I FaceTimed them while I was reading, and I was like, oh my god, who talks like that? If you're a fan of that and that's not going to bug you at all, you would probably give these 5 stars, but that's a huge reason why I knocked off a stars, just because the writing and the dialogue could be so annoying. Otherwise, really fun reads, really healthy romance, and I would recommend them. The next book I read I listened to on audiobook, and it was Of Fire and Stars by Audrey Colthurst, or Colthurst. This is a femme-slash or a lesbian romance between 2 princesses. One of the main characters is a princess who has come to another kingdom to be married off to a prince, but she ends up falling in love with the sister of the prince, who is the castle's stable hand horse trainer. This was such a fun audiobook listen. I just fell in love with these 2 girls. As a horse owner, I was like, yes, brush those ponies. It was a really enjoyable read and it went by fast. I genuinely have no complaints about it other than the world was a bit generic. It's a fantasy setting, so there are characters that have like powers that they're concealing, and there's court drama about whether or not magic should be allowed. In the world itself, even though there's a map and all this political drama, it wasn't necessarily anything new. Sometimes chapters about it could be a bit dry, so I gave Of Fire and Stars 4 stars. And I definitely am on the lookout for more femme/fiction. If you have any recommendations, definitely let me know. The next book I finished is a sequel to another book, and that is Lair of Dreams by Libba Bray. First book in the series is The Diviners, which I'm sure you've heard of. I feel like The Diviners is one of those books that we all know about, but very few people have actually read, which I understand because each of these books are like 600 pages long, 20-hour audiobooks. They're worth the commitment, and if you get them on audiobook especially, they just fly by. It's like you're watching a movie. The series is set in the 1920s in New York and follows a group of teenagers who have powers, and they call themselves the Diviners. The way I describe this series is BuzzFeed Unsolved meets The Great Gatsby. Because it's set in the 20s in New York, it has such a diverse cast of characters, not just with all the different races of all the people who are in New York, but there's also diversity with sexuality, and there's a disabled character. Book 1 is about them hunting ghosts. Book 2 delves into there's this disease that has started afflicting the Chinese population in New York City, and so it takes on this narrative of people talking about xenophobia and the general attitudes of foreigners at the time. I love that this series takes those topics that were relevant in the 20s and completely dispels them and has the characters denounce them on the page. At the same time, it's sad because it also parallels now the same rhetoric we hear with, oh, send them back to their home countries. I think Libba Bray brings up an important discussion about it that definitely does it justice. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I think it's a really interesting read. Like I said, it just flies by like a movie. But this book is very character driven, so it was quite slow. For them trying to solve a mystery about what is this disease happening, how do we stop this, not a lot happened. If I gave you a list of the characters that I love in this series, I would just give you a list of every single character because they are so cool in their own ways. I know the books are a commitment because they're so long, but it is very worth it and very slept on, so get on it. And the final book that I finished in the month of April was Vox by Nicholson Baker. So it's told entirely through dialogue of a conversation on a phone sex hotline. So it's risque, but also introspective. So obviously it just takes place between a male and a female character speaking their minds about sex and vulgarity, while also sort of forming a bond. It's not as vapid as you think it would be. My biggest thought after finishing this book is I wish I would have buddy read it or read it with a book club or for a class or something like that, because there's so much to unpack within it because all of it is dialogue. So there's no hints as to how a character says something or what they mean by that or what they're actually thinking. It really got me thinking about objectification of women because obviously there's talk about porn and the way women are perceived. I can't decide if I like the main character or not. I can't tell if he's creepy because at one point he says that he sexualized Tinkerbell, and then at one point he's like, oh, I hate the way that women in porn just look like they have an empty gaze and the way that men tell them to do things. So I couldn't tell if he was a good person or not, which is why I would love to discuss this book with someone. So it went by super quick. It's like less than 300 pages. If you read it, I would suggest having a buddy do it with you so you can both just relay off each other and be like, what? But I gave it 4 stars and I would love to revisit it in the future and discuss it with someone. That is everything that I read in April. If you've read any of these books, let me know down below. If you have any recommendations for moi, especially lesbian, bisexual, anything female, I really am trying to get more into that. I hope you're all having a wonderful life. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you next time. Goodbye.